Russian messianism, and the sources of Eurasianism. The millenarianism that led to totalitarian catastrophes like Soviet communism and Nazism is back. Many analysts look for different causes to explain the current Russian greed for Ukraine. Some claiming that Putin wants to restore the territory lost with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, or that he was merely responding to the geopolitical provocations of Western powers. In fact, economic, military, political, and geopolitical strategic causes compete alongside utopias arising from messianic beliefs prior to the 20th century, which began to be rescued some time ago by the Kremlin itself. Gary Lachman rescues the messianic doctrines of a world-purifying Russia, disseminated in the so-called Silver Age, a period between 1890 and 1921. The Silver Age, as well as occult utopias born in the 19th century in German intellectual movements, form an important part of the sources of the great totalitarian catastrophe of the following century, represented mainly by Soviet communism and Nazism. Ironically or not, the mystical basis unites both current proponents of a multipolar world order and Western globalists in their New Age spirituality. From traditionalism to anti-traditionalism, from initiation to counter-initiation, spiritual weapons played a very important role in the task of permanent revolution in the 20th century, and it is this rescue that the Savior mission that Russia believes it represents is about. In 2014, at an annual meeting of the country's main party, United Russia, Vladimir Putin recommended some important reading for his regional governors. Considering the line of the books and what they represent in Russian history, the episode is seen as the main sign of a break with the West and the rescue of utopias that were rejected in their original form during the Soviet period. The books Putin asked his governors to read were works of philosophy. They were books of ideas about Russia. There were three. The three thinkers Putin suggested his governors meet were Vladimir Solovyov, a friend of Dostoevsky, and, according to the late American-Russian scholar James Scanlon, the greatest and most influential of Russia's philosophical thinkers. The second was Nikolai Berdyaev, an existential Christian aristocrat considered a philosopher of freedom. And the third was Ivan Ilyin, a more political thinker than Berdyaev or Solovyov, and whose ideas for some form a kind of Russian fascism. What do these authors have in common? They belong to the Silver Age, which was somehow destroyed or prevented from existing by the Bolshevik Revolution, more precisely from the 1920s onwards. The three writers were banned during the Soviet period, and somehow Putin was rescuing something from before the revolution, as a kind of search for remission of communist sins. But what Russia was he rescuing and is being rescued today in his imperial project? Since the 19th century, Russia was a deeply mystical country, with a profusion of Gnostic and esoteric sects that found fertile ground to multiply. The traditionalist student of religions, Mircea Eliade, in his treatise on the history of religions, created the distinction between eras linked to religious concepts. According to his concept, as suggested by Georges Nivet, an expert on the Russian world, the Russian concept of epic or era could be divided into utopian epic and epileptic epic. The epileptic period is a random succession of seizures that does not allow for a perspective view of history. The utopian era is entirely directed towards the end of history and the idea of salvation, writes Nivet. Contrary to what is commonly said and imagined, the authority of the Orthodox Church has always been complicated in Russia, especially in pre-revolutionary periods, as can be seen in Dostoevsky's The Demons. In fact, as Nivet shows, even in the religious environment, spiritual rebellion and sectarianism have always been present, both in conservation movements, such as the Old Believers, and in sects influenced by a type of religious anarchism, leading to both radical atheism and to hermit life. Millennialism was, according to Nivet, one of the most constant aspects of Russian sectarian spirituality. Millennialism is the belief in a prophesied messianic age. Millennial Christians believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ would be manifested by a 1,000-year empire, hence the term millenarianism. According to Nivet, millenarian sectarianism played a very important role in preparing for the revolution. Russian symbolists were very aware of the millenarian phenomenon in Russia. Alexander Blok, still a student, had done research on popular magic. Andrei Bely was very interested in all types of sects, studying them in the Russian countryside with his friend Sergei Solovyov, and his novel The Silver Dove is both political and mystical. In the search for origins that justified communism, intellectuals such as the Marxist Bonch-Bruevich found the influence of sects on Russian society. According to him, the Bespopovцы, the most radical branch of the Old Believers, and the Kchelysty were the expression of primitive communism. In 1912, millenarianism flourished in Tsaritsyn, today Volgograd, and there appeared a new figure called Heliodor. He was an honest monk and a fierce Chernosocienstvo propagandist. Having attacked Rasputin, he was exiled to a monastery and began preaching a form of delusional anarchism. There was a rumor that he was the brother of Nicholas II. Another characteristic of the Russian social psyche is its tendency to deceive itself and the fact that it cherishes the dream of a secret bond between the people and the Tsar. He publicly repented for attacking Jews and intellectuals and proclaimed that church and state were in the hands of the Antichrist. 3,000 former disciples of Heliodor also renounced orthodoxy. The Silver Age, still considered today as an era of mystical awakening, in addition to the intellectual, based on the understanding that Russia had a mission for the world. The same environment that gave the world sick minds like Helena Blavatsky in the 19th century was ready to participate in the mystical awakening that preceded the totalitarian horrors of the century that was beginning. Blavatsky created theosophy through her work The Secret Doctrine, supposedly dictated by a spiritual entity. Through this doctrine, Blavatsky spread occult confusion throughout Europe and the United States, and there are those who say that she had exactly the mission of spreading counter-initiation in esoteric initiatory environments, as a kind of weapon of spiritual warfare against the West. Coincidence or not, the plague of Orientalism that gave rise to the confusing New Age began precisely during this period, and its main initiators were theosophists. In 1893, the first Parliament of Religions, organized by eminent European theosophists and occultists, aimed at bringing East and West closer together. This was Blavatsky's proposal in her doctrine, according to which the knowledge of all traditional religions could be united into a single global doctrine. The process of creating a universal religion is extensively described by writer Li Pin in the book False Dawn. He describes the foundations of what we today call the New Era, but this is a movement that shares the same starting point as the Russian mystical awakening that has come to be rescued by current Russian conservatives. It is no surprise, therefore, that it was Blavatsky's followers who spread across Europe carrying the word of a new era, described long later by Ferguson as the Age of Aquarius, a somewhat distorted vision perhaps due to necessity, to adapt to the already decadent language through the counter-initiatic process. The process of expansion of this esotericism, which began at the beginning of the last century, represented the gestation of the new era, but also of the totalitarian regimes we know. In 1905, theosophist Rudolf Steiner gave a series of lectures in Germany to important figures in the Russian elite at the time. As Lachmann's book reports, Steiner brought a message that had a profound impact on the audience, although this only confirmed impressions increasingly present in that European esoteric elite, whose circles were frequented by influential Russians. Steiner spoke of a global epic guided by Russia, in which there would be a surmounting of eras, the culmination of ancient mystical and prophetic visions. He explained that humanity would be moving into the fifth post-Atlantic epoch. The Atlantic era was Western civilization, a time of individual development that, according to him, needed to be overcome. This overcoming he identified as Russia's mission to the world. It would be the end of what he called the radically individual Western ego, which would give way to an era of collective enlightenment and cooperation. This would have been one of the intellectual sources that inspired the Bolshevik Revolution. It is no coincidence that, at the end of the Soviet period, it was precisely the recovery of this prophetic era that had not yet been reached that guided the creation of new nationalist movements by Dugin and Limonov. In addition to the prophecies of Steiner, Blavatsky, and hundreds of other mystics at the beginning of the century, Russian National Bolshevism was also a rescue of another movement, started in Germany also at the beginning of the century, called Conservative Revolution. This movement sought to create a new nationalism in opposition to both communism and liberalism. It was a group of considerably influential intellectuals during the First War in Germany. Most of these intellectuals joined National Socialism in the 1930s, as is the case of Gottfried Benn, an expressionist poet with an aggressive and nihilistic work openly inspired by Nietzsche. The movement had names less involved with revolutionary politics, such as Hugo von Hofmannsthal and the writer Thomas Mann. But prominent Nazis took part, such as Martin Heidegger himself and Karl Haushofer, both of whom are frequently cited by Alexander Dugin. This explains a lot about what it means to be conservative in Russia. Through a postmodern movement that mixed occultism and Nazi aesthetics, ideologists recovered the prophecy of Jean Parvulescu, who in 1976 predicted the emergence of a man who would rescue Russia and make it the great beacon that would guide Russia. Humanity for 1,000 years, what Dugin called the Empire of the End. In a recently published article recalling his influence on Ukraine's current invasion policy, Dugin writes, "I was radically against everything that the Russian government thought in the 1990s, but I was listened to by the Russian military since the beginning of the 1990s. I started teaching geopolitics classes at the Russian General Staff Institution, and for them this was absolutely necessary because they lost the explanation of what is happening in ideological terms and urgently needed something as an alternative. They could not understand why NATO was moving closer and closer to our borders with us abandoning our communist ideology. They honestly couldn't understand why. But with the geopolitics presented to the General Staff, everything was theoretically, at least logically, put into context. This was the beginning of Putin's secret rise to power." Lachman justifies the importance of the subject by its importance for both Putin and his intellectual gurus. The fate of Russia seems to have guided the concerns of several generations of writers and mystics. If, at the very least, it is a new form of Russian propaganda, its study is still urgent given evident demonstrations of expansionism and the fascination of unsuspecting conservative Westerners with the promise of restoration of the spirit,